Ayukawa is joining us from Tokyo. We are also joined from Burlington, Vermont by Arnie Gundersen, nuclear industry executive for decades before blowing the whistle on the company he worked for in 1990 when he found inappropriately stored radioactive material, now chief engineer at Fairewinds Associates. You are concerned, Arnie Gundersen, and quoted in many of the papers today from the Washington Post to the New York Times, about the similarity of the plant in Japan with the plant in Vermont, Vermont Yankee. Can you explain?
Yeah, the plant in Japan was 40 years old in March. The plant in Vermont is 39 years old in March. So they're about a year apart. Same vendor, same conceptual design. Actually, the plant in Japan was built to withstand was better built, was stronger built because of earthquake resistance in Japan. So the American reactor is, in fact, weaker than the Japanese reactor. But conceptually, there's 23 of them, including the one here in Vermont, but also Pilgrim right next to Boston, and also Oyster Creek, which is in New Jersey, that are old plants of the same vintage.
The Japanese reactors made by General Electric, your plant in Vermont made by?
General Electric.
Your plant, Arnie Gundersen, in Vermont is made by?
Is made by General Electric, and it's also a Mark I containment, which is the same containment that's causing problems right now in Japan. This containment is the smallest containment ever built. And even in 1972, the NRC had concerns about this containment. And we've gotten memos through FOIA that indicate in 1972, the NRC thought that perhaps this particular design should never have been built. So it's not something that popped up like a mushroom last month, but it's been known to the industry since 1972 that this is a weak link in the design.
What's interesting in Vermont is you have a governor, Governor Shumlin, who wants to shut down the Vermont Yankee. And he, when he was a state legislator, represented the particular area that Vermont Yankee is in. But Arnie Gundersen, can you explain to us more what is happening in Japan right now? The issue of partial meltdown versus full meltdown, the fuel rods being exposed and the danger.
Yeah. When the reactor shuts down, what that means is that the uranium atom doesn't split anymore, but these pieces that are left behind are still radioactive, and they generate about 5% of the reactor's heat. And you've got to dump that heat for as long as a year or two or three. So what's happened is that there has been no way to remove that heat, and that's caused the nuclear fuel to hit 2,200 degrees. At that point, the nuclear fuel begins to suck up the oxygen atoms in water. Water's H2O. And that gives off hydrogen gas. So the hydrogen explosions that we're seeing at two of these reactors are an indication that the water is being stripped of its oxygen and creating hydrogen. So the cores are uncovered, and when the cores are uncovered, unfortunately, that's what happens. Now, the problem in the long haul is that now that these cores have been uncovered and there's no way to cool them, they will have to continuously vent these containments. And as the Times said, you're not going to get back into these villages in the next week or two. It could easily be months, if not years, before these villages can be inhabited again.
The effects of radiation on humans, Arnie Gundersen?
It's too early to tell, but as your previous speaker said, you know, they tested, they talk about 160 people that have been contaminated. That's all they've tested. Basically, everything they're testing is coming up contaminated in that inner couple of miles around the plant. You've got radiation being detected 60 miles to the north on a Navy helicopter, 100 miles to the east on a Navy aircraft carrier. So it's not clear to me that that cloud is not looping around and affecting Japan. And of course, I think the worst case, as Mr. Kamps suggested, is that the fuel pools on these reactors that sit very high, and they're designed just like the Vermont Yankee one. If the fuel pools are not cooled, they will melt down, in which case we're going to have Chernobyl on steroids.
I want to go back to Harvey Wasserman. The news out of Switzerland, they've suspended the approvals process for 3 nuclear power stations so safety standards can be revisited after the crisis in Japan. The German government facing pressure to reverse its plan to extend the life of Germany's 17 nuclear reactors as domestic opponents of atomic power took Japan's worsening nuclear crisis as validation of their views. Talk about the reaction now around the world, these protests that are taking place.
Well, the protests are huge, Amy, and specifically here in the United States, we're facing 2 very tangible issues in the near term. The owners of the nuclear plants all across the United States, including these very old reactors, some of which are virtually identical to Fukushima 1, are going in for license extensions. And so you have reactors that are 40 or approaching 40 years old, more than 30 years old, and the owners are asking the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and getting approval to extend their life. I hope that the NRC and that the public in general will take note that these reactors now cannot withstand these kinds of pressures and should absolutely not have their license extended. Secondly, we're facing in the Congress pressure from the Obama administration and from supporters of the nuclear industry to give them $36 billion in loan guarantees to build still more nuclear plants. This is something that really has to be stopped, because we've seen in Japan, and both Kevin and I have been there, and we've seen the kinds of things that the industry has said, the kind of safety that they claim that they can deliver, that these are false promises. And I tell you that the Japanese industry assured the Japanese public that Fukushima and there are 55 reactors in Japan, all of which are on earthquake faults and near the ocean. The Japanese industry assured the Japanese public that these reactors could withstand exactly these kinds of events. This is not a surprise, what's happened at Fukushima. This was predicted. We've predicted similar things here in the United States, especially at those reactors in California. They are going for license extension at Diablo Canyon. This is unconscionable, especially in light of what's happened here. So these are tangible things that are happening. These demonstrations around the world will certainly escalate, because we've seen now that the nuclear industry cannot be trusted, and this technology simply does not belong on this planet.
Harvey
I want to
Wasserman,
add one other thing, by the way. None of the reactors in the United States are insured. None of the reactors in the United States are insured beyond $12.4 billion. If such an accident happened here, the economic burden will fall directly on the taxpayers and on the victims, not on the owners of the plants.
Harvey Wasserman, editor of Nuclear.org, Yurika Ayukawa joining us from Tokyo, from Citizens Nuclear Information Center. Thank you to Arnie Gundersen, who joined us from Vermont, a longtime nuclear whistleblower at Vermont Yankee. And finally, thanks to Keven Kamps, who is a specialist at Nuclear Watchdog Beyond Nuclear.